Day 1301 of the war. Russia is losing the war, said Trump's special ambassador to Ukraine Kellogg in Kyiv. Losses have over 1 million and progress is meters. Right words. The question is what the U.S. will do to help Russia lose and Ukraine win. American officers suddenly announced their training in West 2025 in Belarus. This is another step for Trump in approaching Lukashenko's regime. We've still got to understand why. Judging by nothing new, the Americans haven't seen anything new in their training. Z-channels complain that drones on training grounds can drop free-falling locks as if there weren't a single one in Syria or the Russia-Ukraine war. In August, Ukraine struck record 45 Russian objects, half of which are relatives of the oil and gas industry. Russia has been striking Ukrainian tractors in Sumy for some time now. Apparently, the authorities later reported that they sent military gear and launchers for drone operators, as well as a couple of NATO generals. The Russian Defense Forces continue to pressure the Russian 51st Army near Pokrovsk, Azovia, reporting Pankivka's liberation. The penetration rate of the so-called breakthrough in Dobropillia has decreased to up to 5 kilometers, most of which are gray zone. The situation in other directions is worsening. The commander, Syrskyi, reported that the commanders responsible for defending the area in the South Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia directions. The Russian authorities have come up with a new way to bait the Russians into messenger Max, which he is truly inspired by. Now the search for confirmation of the dead soldiers is possible only there. Relatives of the dead fear sharing personal data, and it's unclear where, but they have no special choice. Messenger Max will even go to morgue. This and much more in today's fresh update, which you can support with your likes, comments, and subscriptions to the channel. These actions help promote the video, and your subscriptions are especially important for YouTube's algorithms, so don't forget to subscribe with the button where it is located and be sure to click it. If you want to support the channel financially, the Patreon link is also in the description. You can also buy an NVPN, a tool for bypassing restrictions which allows you to bypass restrictions, watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, go to blocked media, call Discord, Telegram, WhatsApp. In short, use the internet for real and not the way Vladimir Putin wants you to use it, just to watch videos about how great he is. So install NVPN, buy it by the link in the description. Well, by buying NVPN, you're supporting the release of new videos on this channel. I'll also note that in Russia, it's still allowed to buy NVPNs and use them. And we're moving on to what happened and became known in the past day. U.S. Secretary of State Kellogg said the Russian Federation is effectively losing the war against Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine's army demonstrated strength by pushing Russians back, proving that Moscow's army is significantly weaker than what Russian leader Vladimir Putin is trying to show. Kellogg made such a statement during the Yalta European Strategy Forum on September 14. I will now give you the entire speech of Kellogg and the resumption of the Ukrainian publication Observatel to show what opinion the person most close to the American administration has in getting acquainted with the situation in Ukraine, and even the real army experience, not the developer or Fox News. According to Kellogg, in fact, Putin is playing the war against Ukraine because he did not achieve his goals in more than 3 years of a full-scale invasion. If he had won, he would have been in Kyiv. If he had won, he would have been west of Dnipro. If he had won, he would have been in Odessa. If he had won, he would have replaced the government. Russia is actually playing this war. Now they are making progress. Special Ambassador Kellogg said they are slightly advancing in the Donetsk-Donbas region. Kellogg added, if you consider the Russians' progress with the meters rather than the million, then okay, it's successful, but the price they pay for those meters is huge, and I don't think people really value it. This is a number, but the number of losses, if you talk about the dead and the wounded, significantly exceeds 1 million. They left Afghanistan, losing 18,000 people. We left Vietnam, losing 65. They lost more than 1 million dead and wounded. If you think about it, these numbers match the level of the Second World War, he said. This is a defeat involved in people losses. It's devastating, Kellogg continued, especially regarding the Russia's frontline units that they've occupied in Ukraine and attempted to capture in February 2022. These frontline units are gone, that's why. They belong to the second, third, or fourth iteration of wartime commanders. They get Naftalin's tanks from museums to put them on the front line, Kellogg said. He also noted Ukraine's defense success, noting that Russians can't move large groups because Ukrainians kill them, Ukrainians fight. They did well on this mission, said Donald Trump's special envoy. I would have been very concerned if Putin were here. According to him, current Russia is not the same as it was during the Cold War. When we had 354,000 American soldiers in Germany and other places, we had to protect the Fulton Corridor, but this is Germany's territory, which in the Cold War era was considered one of the main targets of a potential invasion by warship forces. This is not Russia, times of your mother. This is a completely different Russia. This is Russia talking about a big game, but I do think they are. I think that even now, considering the Europeans' positions, I would be very concerned if Putin were, Kellogg said. He added that Putin is threatened by peace with nuclear weapons for no reason, as Russia has it not alone. He sometimes says, we're a nuclear power, and I'd remind him the US is a nuclear power too, including the UK and France. I would say just put that in his response. Russia's army is not as strong as Putin says. Kellogg said that recently in the White House's official office, a discussion took place during which they talked about supposedly surpassing Russia's military capacity and that they are quite impossible. Kellogg also added that he does think anyone should be afraid of Russian troops. I don't believe they have the potential to advance to or anywhere else, Trump's special representative concluded. From all this, it's logical to conclude that, to put it mildly, Putin and Russia only need to be pushed a little further, for it to finally collapse and slip through peace and ask the world for favorable conditions for Ukraine and the West, and for this to be the best and shortest way to end the war. We're waiting for that to reach Trump's administration. For now, let's note that all of Kellogg's conversations are useful. In the White House, that's the way it is. It's hard to imagine that they would agree to even cut off Putin's terms. Russia giving up Donbass and effectively no security guarantees for Ukraine. And Kellogg not only makes loud statements, he bases each one. He doesn't talk about Russia losing its influence on the international level or the pro-Russian economy. However, if he doesn't, we'll talk about it in a separate video. This is where Arestovich came out and started claiming that Putin outplayed everyone. I think these two positions, Kellogg's and Arestovich's, can be compared and according to objective criteria, which we'll discuss today or the day after. Yeider writes about the warming of relations between Washington and Minsk. Defense Minister Victor Hrenin, whose name always makes me laugh, reported on the American military attaché at the West 2025 training ground, citing Belka and the Belarusian Ministry of Defense. Russia and Belarus began exercises ZAPA 25 on training grounds in both countries on Friday in response to the intensification of relations with NATO 2 days after Poland was shot down by Russian drones invading its airspace. According to Bell's report, 23 countries, including 2 other NATO members, Turkey and Hungary, were observed during the exercises. The Ministry of Defense of Belarus published a video showing 2 American officers in a uniform thanked Hrenin for the invitation and shook his hand. Sorry, we'll show you everything you want, anything you want. You can come and look, talk to people, the minister said. The presence of American officers is another sign of the warming between Washington and Minsk, Moscow's close ally, allowing Russia to use its territory to send tens of thousands of soldiers to Ukraine in February 2022, Reuters comments. Last week, the U.S. Ambassador John Cole met with a Belarusian president in Minsk, after which a resolution was made to release 52 prisoners and cancel U.S. sanctions against Belarus. Trump, who is trying to end the war in Ukraine, has closer ties with Lukashenko, who regularly negotiations with Putin, notes Yeider. Here I want to emphasize the obvious. Lukashenko is definitely smarter than Trump. There are no questions at all. Lukashenko stands out against all dictators. Don't compliment him. This slippery bug came to power some time ago as a result of elections and also as a real oppositioner. He filigree and controls the balance between Europe and Russia. More precisely, he did it until 2020, when he fell into Putin. But this old-fashioned nonsense will still survive on us, unfortunately. So of course, Lukashenko will use Trump's plan to unify Belarus and Russia to the maximum. Minsk has already reached the point of removing sanctions from Belarus, which means very soon parts for aircraft will go to Russia through the Belarusian airline, so it'll be another Trump failure. And don't forget, Lukashenko is a real tyrant who killed many political opponents and screwed the society. Lukashenko must be condemned and punished. Unfortunately, he will hardly make it out of power soon. But apparently, the U.S. armed forces didn't see anything new in the exercises or didn't see what Kellogg was talking about, that the Russian army is just making it look as strong as it is, because the Z channels have criticized the image shown by the Ministry of Defense. The exercises were held without any SVO experience, they wrote, despite statements about the opposite. Here's, for example, a comment from the Z Channel answerer. Again, he writes, with the help of West 25. During exercises, the Tu-22 M3 drops a FAB 250-270 down on the enemy from a conditional altitude of 1,000 meters. For those who have no experience in Western countries and can't handle it, even experience in combat theater in Syria should have shown that all these planes with free-falling air bombs in modern realities are nothing more than a bunch of debris grabbed by a fire in the future, and in conditions conditions where the enemy lacks any air defense resources, the possibility of such approaches can still be far-fetched with the presence of the same Su-34 Zapad, which, despite its calculations, will correct its mistakes about the lack of cheap high-precision weapons for aviation. If all these calculations are relevant with drops from short heights, as soon as the enemy's conditional weapons hold at least the same PZRK, the aircraft will have to gain altitude in order to avoid a hypothetical intercept, while the circles, likely deviations, will rapidly increase to the level where the enemy headquarters fell. But experience in Syria didn't teach them anything, and we joined the SVO with the same ideas. It would seem that the SVO should at least learn something, but training for combat missions was done taking the SVO into account, or someone is just conducting training on F***CK off, complains. The Z channel? The Americans watched all of this, but at the same time, listen, again, I don't want the words of Kellogg and the stories of the Z channels about these exercises, and about how well the Russian army learned anything to be misled. The Russian army is still huge. It still has an advantage over missiles, it still has an advantage over planes, it still has an advantage over the number of strike drones, and so on. Currently, it's one of the most serious opponents in the world. Yes, it could be much strong if the Russian army were based on the meritocracy principle, if money wasn't wasted, if the commanders weren't idiots. Yes, Russia could be, quite frankly, the first army in the world. But now it's really one of the world's strongest armies just because they have 3.5 years of combat experience, and because they've already moved into a modern war with FPV drones, strike drones, and so on. That's why you shouldn't underestimate this enemy. It's truly a still powerful enemy, and many European countries Russia could really shift in several weeks. To combine them, they can only harm Ukraine right here and now, thanks to the fact that Ukraine is also developing and has become one of Europe's and the planet's most powerful armies, at least considering their combat experience and the development of modern war methods. But one drone is not enough. It's important that someone launches them. It's important that there be fighters who, every day, risk their lives, give their lives, fight for their country. And we, these fighters, can help them. We can save the lives of these people. We can help them destroy fascists and occupiers. And in fact, I will do this as much as I can and hope that you will join me too. Therefore, we continue to raise funds for the unit of strike UAVs of the 28th Mechanized Brigade of the 2nd Battalion. Since they are in the Donetsk region, and to put it mildly, their positions are very, very secret, then the video shows everything blurred and blurred as the soldiers themselves are hidden, but I communicate with them directly, verify everything, of course, so I remind you of their appeal to you. We, the subordinates of strike UAVs of the 28th Brigade and of the 2nd Mechanized Battalion, ask for support from subscribe to the Telegram and YouTube channels of Michael Nacke. Our unit works in Donbass and effectively destroys the enemy, but with your help it will destroy even more and better. Thank you and glory to Ukraine. There's a QR code for Monobank in the description, along with private, PayPal, cryptocurrency, USD10, TRC20, and Bitcoin. Let's help Ukrainian soldiers together in this war. This is the most effective help here and now that you can provide. This directly impacts the front, directly impacts the lives of Ukrainian soldiers, so check the link in the description or via QR code on Monobank. I have already participated in the fundraising too. Hopefully we can close it soon, and accordingly, drone operators will be provided with the necessary equipment to continue defending their country. And now, let's move on. Russia's Foreign Minister Radoslav Siverskyi, after a massive strike on Russian drones, called on Ukraine's unmanned air defense zones to consider. Less than 3 years have passed. This policy was discussed in an interview with the publication FASS, reported Militarny. The minister still doesn't know Russia's goals on Poland's territory, but he doesn't believe 19 drones suddenly end up with Ukraine. First and foremost, this should be perceived as a signal to accelerate our defense preparations. With Donald Trump's first cadence, we Europeans spent twice on defense. In The Hague, we agreed on twice again. But only a few % of aircraft cannot be defended against drones. Money needs to be spent correctly, he said, responding to the question of what Poland, NATO, and EU signal should send Russia in light of this incident. He also emphasized that Ukraine significantly advances its partner countries in anti-drone defense and noted the need to take this experience and create joint enterprises for drone production. They're building a central factory producing strike drones, drone interceptors, and missiles, saying the best way to help is joint production both in Ukraine and in our own countries, for Ukraine and for us ourselves. He believes this would be extremely beneficial for both sides, he said. According to Syrskyi, the idea of a drone zone was discussed back in 2024 when Joseph Biden was US president. Technically, NATO and the EU are capable of that, but Poland cannot make such a decision on its own, only with allies. Protection for our population, for example, from debris falling would, of course, be better if we could destroy drones and other air objects outside our territory. If Ukraine asked us to shoot them down over its territory, that would be beneficial for us. If you ask me personally, we need to think about it, he explained. Politico specifically focused on imposing sanctions, particularly against dark fleet of oil tankers transporting Russian oil. In the first 2 years of Russian aggression, we spent a lot of time together and little action, he said. Now that Putin is influencing our borders, there's finally no time for slowdown, he concluded. Words not from the boy but from his husband, but unfortunately he still has words, technically, and from the point of view of developing the future, definitely. This all should have been done a long time ago. And what I said, in my opinion, back in February 2022. Not that I know the future, but it's clear why this wasn't done. Fear of escalation, blah blah blah, and so on. Medvedev also came out from the bench and said, if drones are being shot down in Ukraine and European countries, then it's a war with NATO. But he was talking both about tanks Leopard, about supplying HIMARS, about supplying F-16, about supplying ATKMS, about allowing ATKMS to shoot at Russian territory. Well, so it's a real Russian scare that they've been using for the past 3.5 years. Moreover, Peskov said later, the war with NATO is already actually going on, but if it goes on, NATO could appear in some way in the war. That would be not bad. But nevertheless, unconditional talks are right, the intention is right, and Poland, like no other, I think, understands all the threats that exist now. And not only are they known words, but they also mean things. Because Poland, of all the European countries, has increased its defense rate by % among all European countries. So I hope all of this won't remain just words, though the hope is very magical. The Okogoro channel summarizes Ukraine's strike campaign against Russia's infrastructure site for August. Only 45 strikes recorded so far. The channel's author read out the record: 8 oil bases, gas LPD, 14 flights via refineries, 2 airfields, 12 JD infrastructure, 3 depots, 6 enterprises linked to the DPRK. Let's hope that September will be no less effective for Ukrainian deep strike. We'll wrap up this campaign soon, but what I see in the last days fits me well. The Ukrainian General Staff published details about the strikes on Russian headquarters in Donetsk a week ago. Here's what they wrote. We'll clarify the results of the strikes on Russian occupiers' command posts, confirmed the hit of the enemy personnel, including from the command number. Let's recall they wrote that on September 8, 2025, Ukrainian Defense Forces carried out a complex fire strike on Russian troops' command posts in the occupied territory of the Donetsk region. With the help of missile troops, artillery, and air forces of Ukraine's unmanned systems, command posts of the Russian armed forces, command units of the Central Group, and the 41st Combined Arms Army of the Russian Armed Forces. These military formations of the enemy are operating in the Pokrovsk direction. Before that, on August 28, the Russian military command post in this direction was visited by the Minister of Defense of the country, aggressor Andriy Belousov. Soon after his visit, the places, locations, command of the occupation army were successfully hit. Hits on these military targets significantly disrupt the command units of the Russian armed forces. Ukraine's defense forces continue engaged in verified strikes on the aggressor's targets, ordering the Russian Federation to cease the capture war, they write. We are also continuing to learn the consequences of the Ukrainian strike campaign on Russian oil processing. Objects, one of the largest Russian oil refineries, lost about a quarter of its power after a UAV strike. The Kyryshneftyrk refinery in the Leningrad region shut down an oil processing plant after a fire that caused the drone's attack on September 14, according to Reuters and 2 Industry. Sources: the refinery, owned by Surgut Oil and held second in Russia in terms of processing volume up to 20 million tons per year, damaged a AT-6 unit, which holds almost 40% of the plant's capacity. The furnace and other equipment were damaged, and according to preliminary estimates, repair may take about a month, Reuters sources said. According to agency spokespeople, the refinery will increase the load on other active systems by 15–20%, which would partially compensate for the lost capacity. As expected, the refinery will be able to work with a load of 70–75%. Last year, Kyiv processed 17.5 million tons of oil and released over 9 million tons of gasoline and diesel. According to the volume of the refinery, it supplies only the Omsk refinery, Gazprom Oil, with a capacity of 22 million tons per year. Astra noted the attack on the WFE refinery I mentioned a few days ago. On September 13, the Ukrainian drone attacked the Boshneft refinery on Byatsky Tract Street, according to Astra sources in the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations. A UAV AFT-1 unit damaged gas pipeline pipelines and a match collector, causing a fire. Another UAV hit Boshneftnovel refinery. The Ukrainian oil refinery hit the aft 6 unit, harming 2 pipelines with water and nitrogen. Refineries are located a distance of 3 kilometers from each other. 70 people were evacuated to the refinery, 284 were sheltered in special fortifications. There were no casualties. Boshneftnovel and its refinery have been owned by Rosneft since 2016. Refineries process oil and release gasoline, diesel fuel, aviation, kerosene, oil chemicals. Russia, meanwhile, has not stopped. Striking the Ukrainian civilian. For structure, on September 14, 2025, at about 23:00, Russia carried out 2 missile strikes on agriculture-industrial territory. Moreover, Russia has not abandoned oil refineries. Russia carried out 2 missile strikes on agriculture-industrial territory in the Sumy region, reported in the local prosecutor's office. 20 people were wounded and did not participate in the strike. About 30 farmland units were damaged. If we recall the recent story of the strike on the humanitarian mission in Chernihiv region, it can be assumed that they once again reported on destroying a Ukrainian military base or even the UAV launch site. Another war crime for the sake of the check marks in the Defense Ministry reports, and the end of it is not clear until Ukrainian missiles reach the Russian launchers. Let's hope it happens as soon as possible. In the meantime, the Russian threat, or rather the threat to Russian strikes by UAVs, will increase. 30,000 Shaheds-type drones will launch the Russian armed forces this year and plan to double this number next year, writes the New York Times. Scale of Russian attacks has dramatically changed in the last months, the publication notes. If 3 years ago Moscow got in the headlines of the world media, launching 43 drones in one attack, then in this month, over the border, more than 800 strike drones and false goals were sent over the night. In 2025, Russia has already launched more than 34,000 strike drones and false goals in the direction of Ukraine, almost 9 times more than in the similar period last year. Moscow has also changed its tactics of using drones. Now drones are sent by reels or waves along Republicans to divert attention from real targets. Russia uses more false goals because of colored pimplasts and plywood, which are no different in the sky from real combat drones. Drone pilots have begun to fly higher and bypass open fields where Ukrainian air defense units are working, preferring routes over rivers and forests. The numbers are 30, and in the perspective of 60,000 sheiks per year, it means that Ukraine will need at least 2 more interceptor drones to repel this threat. The goal doesn't look promising, especially since, as we remember, Ukraine agreed to help the UK, having shut itself out, and the EU is preparing €6 billion for only drone days. Considering that one interceptor costs up to $5,000, production costs could easily be estimated in that amount. But of course, it's not just about production but also about preparing pilots and an improved monitoring system for detection of targets. And all of this needs to be done right now, preparing 2,000 drones for one night after the strikes. Ukraine's defense forces continue counterattacks on the so-called Dobropillia direction, which we're monitoring like some thriller. Russia's troops are under a threat to encirclement. This report was published in the 1st Azov National Guard Corps. Defense forces units operating in the operational zone of the 1st Azov Corps continue liberating territory on the Dobropillia direction. As a result of coordinated actions, Ukrainian armed forces units have cleared the settlement of Pankivka and adjacent territories. Russians continue to increase their troop grouping. To strengthen offensive potential, the Russian command moved additional reserves from the 1st Azov Corps as part of 4 infantry brigades and 1 regiment of naval infantry into the zone of responsibility of the NGU Azov Corps. Ukraine's defense forces are doing everything they can to stop Russian advance and prevent a breakthrough in defense, Azov was assured. Pankivka's liberation was confirmed by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, clarifying that 225 assault regiments participated in it, followed by the Deep State and the 225th Armed Forces themselves, according to the project map between the zones of confident control of Ukraine's. Defense forces on both sides of the salient at the site of the so-called Russian breakthrough on Dobropillia remains less than 5 kilometers, and most of it is already a gray zone. The main intrigue in this direction, and perhaps on the entire front, is whether Ukrainians will be able to close this boiler. This has practically eliminated all territorial successes achieved by Russian armed forces during the breakthrough, as well as a large number of Russian armed forces personnel. In fact, we have been actively monitoring all these days behind this cart. At the same time, deep state analysts also noted that Russian armed forces managed to advance to Zverevy, south of Pokrovsk, and in the Orkovo area of the administrative border of Dnipropetrovsk region. The Battle of Zapad continues, however, mostly between the General Staff and Yuri Podolyak, a Z-war blogger Yuri Podolyak, the largest of them. Once again, it's quite justified, but it's about anti-crisis comrades in a propaganda workshop trying to prove Russian control over Kupiansk. Here, what he writes, assaulting Kupiansk, a lot lot of chaos and a lack of control. I can't help but be surprised at the restless nature of anti-crisis authors who accelerate on some TG channels daily as an excuse to control most of Kupiansk. Today, this message appeared on the networks. Kupiansk is practically the entire city before the Osinivka-Kavsharivka White Zone line. Being located on cover is impossible. Small groups of Ukrainian forces are hiding in basements and houses. Conducting assaults during the day is difficult due to the vast number of FPVs. The author allegedly comments, what should supposedly happen? The authors want to tell you about the anti-crisis, meaning there is essentially no control over the Ukrainian forces. The city is a large white zone. To the assault troops of Russian forces, there's only left to achieve the remaining small groups of the enemy sitting along the basement. That is, a thesis is deliberately forced that the city is already almost ours. The most noticeable thing is that in the message, no word is a lie, which is interesting, but the truth is not all. If it were about this way, practically the entire city, a gray zone being on the map, is impossible. Small groups of Ukrainian forces hiding in the basement and houses. Assaulting the active defense is difficult during the day due to the huge number of FPVs and so on for more than a month. So not much was added, the truth, but how it changes the meaning, notes Podolyaka, meaning the city is basically completely uncontrolled. Our small groups spend the night trying to get where they can and spend the day in the basement. Then if they haven't been spotted or destroyed, they try to establish a foothold, and the enemy tries to detect them and destroy them, as in the hospital district in yesterday's video. Podolyaka likely means this video, where they disassemble FPV drones to cover up Russian troops geolocated deep state in the Med College area in the city center. And all of this continues, Podolyaka, as if it's because we, the Ukrainians, don't have the full control over this city. And another reason is the presence of civilians in good numbers, since full evacuation from the city hasn't been possible. That's why we Ukrainians too often change into civilian uniforms as an extra camouflage factor. By the way, for this reason, often no one can sort out who is who, so they expel everyone, sometimes even their own. At the same time, judging by the frame of objective control, so far, more leverages to control the city are still with the Ukrainians, admits Podolyaka. We more or less confidently control only the northern and northwestern outskirts. Ukrainian defense forces control the southern part of the city. The rest is a vast gray zone where attacking actions are conducted both by us and by the Ukrainians. Caps Lock'em ends with Podolyaka, apparently to emphasize the idea that fighting for the city is far from unilateral and that Kupiansk's fate is still not allowed. The Russians continue their offensive along both banks of the Siverskyi Donets river, in the neighboring and closely connected Limansky and Siverskyi directions, where they claim to have recognized the occupation by Russian troops of Grigorovka and noted the Russian advances near Yampol. Footage from Yampol was also posted from footage from Yampol, and they were commented on this way. Footage from Yampol, and they were commented on this way. This is how Russians walk in the village of Yampol wearing civilian clothes to put on makeup. Another violation of international law from Russian military, who, as seen in the footage in civilian clothes, are given a fire from a rifle. Now the Russians have managed to escape to Yampol, but Ukrainian defense forces immediately began a hunt on them. Russian fighters hide in houses, basement, grave, and so on. It is especially worth noting that work on Russian armed forces is strongly hindered by civilians who have evacuated from the settlement, and the Russians, using this method, are hiding in the same houses. We are monitoring the situation. Because the Russians' capture, especially in the Impol area, happened more than once. They found a place to sneak into the village, so it's worth noting the increase in activity toward the settlement, which they have aimed to capture, knowing its importance and criticism for all positions located eastward. Just through Yampol, I'll add logistical routes for the remaining Ukrainian positions in the Serebryansk Forestry and Vicinity Pass. Now active combat actions continue in the village, and their post in Deep State. The Russian advance in the southern operational zone remains unmatched, largely due to its terrain. Fields mix with small, rare villages. Deep State notes Russian advances in Novovanovka, Zaporizhzhia, Berezhia, and Ivanovka, Dnipropetrovsk region. As a result of the Russian offensive, the zone was forced to evacuate as 7 children expanded in Dnipropetrovsk region. Another 18 settlements of the Sinelnikov district were reported in the local OVA. We're talking about the village of Pokrovsk and neighboring settlements. Pokrovsk is about 20 kilometers from the contact line. The Okogoro resource counted based on a report by the Ukrainian General Staff that the average daily number of Russian attacks in August 2025 was 143, which is 12% less than in July. A third of all combat clashes over the past month occurred in the Pokrovsk direction, another third in the Limansk, Novopavlovka, and the South Donetsk directions. The channel also measures the number of attacks along this direction. It may be noted that there are fewer Russian assaults in the Pokrovsk and Sumy directions, especially in Sumy region, almost double. Meanwhile, in the southern Donetsk direction, Russians attacked 20% more often. Let me remind you that the deep state also recorded a decrease in the number of Russian attacks, but explained it as a large-scale regrouping by way of a new Russian strike, the prospects of which we discussed last week. If we believe the analysts' forecasts in September and the following months, we can expect a new growth of Russian activity on the front. Deputy Commander Alexander Syrskyi captured the commanders' positions with 2 corps, the head of the 17th Corps, Vladimir Salenko, and the 20th, Maxim Kitugin. This was reported by 2 reporters at the Ukrainian Truth in the Defense Forces. Both commanders replaced their positions roughly a week or 2 ago. According to the reporters, this decision is related to the commanders' losses in the Corps' responsibility zone. The 17th Corps, headed by Salenko, is in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, where the defense forces have recently lost the village of Kamenskoye and some of the villages of Plavny, located on the bank of the Dnipro. The 20th Corps, headed by Kyiv, is located on the border of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblasts, where Russians managed to break through Dnipropetrovsk region. These are the first shifts since the defense forces switched to a core control system. In reality, it's a good trend. Let's hope that Ukraine's defense forces won't end up without invaders like that Russian General Akhmedov. Although, of course, it's clear that some shifts won't solve systematic defense problems. They need comprehensive reforms, which analysts, soldiers, and volunteers have been talking about for a long time. Russian troops in the offensive don't feel embarrassed to use forbidden weapons. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the radical, chemical, and biological defense forces reported more than 11,000 cases of Russian chemical weapons against Ukraine's defense forces. This was reported by a correspondent from the military briefing of Ukraine's Armed Forces Support Forces. Russian intelligence units search for plants and ammunition debris and send them for laboratory analysis. About 40% have grenades with chemicals, the others are unidentified examples. The main means of supply is the drop of K-51 and RGO grenades from drones. They are used to entice soldiers out of cover. Most of these cases are recorded on Russian forces' active advance directions. For their own sake, let's remind ourselves that recently the Ukrainian investigation project, schemes, established that enterprises supplying precursors and components for the production of chemical grenades are still under sanctions. It's no coincidence, let's remind ourselves, that for the last time chemical weapons in Europe were used by the Nazis and also in Ukraine with similar objectives, to expel Soviet soldiers from cauldrons near Odessa and Sevastopol, as well as on the Kerchensk Peninsula. And of course, we all remember how the Kremlin and its propagandists covered brotherly the Syrian regime of Assad, who poisonized Zarin Khlor and its own civilians and ended this regime. We also remember that Z-Channel Yasinovatea Donbas on the fire line provides a video of the aftermath of the assault, upon which the Russian road is covered with the bodies of Russian soldiers who apparently didn't reach those of the Russian positions. A reality of a modern war in all manifestations that are not reported on TV. Comments on the post paid attention to compiler Z-Nidia, Ivan Filipov. Serviceman's habit harms more than rescue soldiers. The facts of such an organization and the provision of assaults, according to healthy logic, must be covered, defined, and removed from command with the translated assault by commanders and organizers of such attempts. Why not free Belov and order him to provide security at each attempt, after which he can evaluate the effectiveness during the tasks assigned and the level of losses inflicted? It's worth noting the myth about Belam. The commander of the 110th Assault Brigade, Vladimir Novikov, who, let me remind you, fought in some Donetsk refinery with prosecutor's office, and later in his unit, found soldiers in prisons, which can happen anywhere in the Russian unit, but Belam wasn't lucky enough because of his aid at the prosecutor's office. The myth about his successes is actively spread by ZVNKOR Andriy Filatov, who claims that he managed to defeat Ukrainian drone operators in the battle for Malaya Neva during his cooperation with Belam. But the problem with this myth is exactly the same as, for example, the incredible stories of Soviet propaganda in the Second World War, like the 28 Panfils. These events do not remind the enemy at all. If the work of the Russian center's drone operators is run by Rubicon, Ukrainian soldiers are writing constantly as a real threat, you won't find the same posts about Beloy and Orksov. But that's not important. Skeptics and Z-channels need a myth that there are real commanders in the Russian army, but the command doesn't let them turn around and lock them up in the cage, as they locked up their subordinates, demanding money from them. Filipov drew attention to another noteworthy posting: the deep crisis of Russian Z-volunteers. Military volunteer Rodriguez writing, Filipov, who supplies Dynamic Defense Corps, says he can't help the army in this matter anymore. Combined loans and no one cares. Remember, these are the little tanks you see on the tanks, among which there's an explosives. When hit, it explodes and softens the effect of an enemy ammunition. Well, F equals S, you know. Well, Russian tank operators almost always have loitering tanks without dynamic protection like the DZ, which they tried to fix Rodriguez. Another clear proof that volunteer movement with the help of the front experienced serious problems, concludes Filipov precisely Rodriguez's post as follows. The tanker's day is over, thank God. Now I can announce that my tanker's production has been halted. I gave the last game at Horlovka to the tankers of the 103rd Regiment. In total, during the SVO, we made 143 kits under 300 KDZ, contact 1. Andrei Kharkov, the architect, made something of almost 900. Together, we defeated 1,000 light tanks. I can't continue production. There's no support from the state or the business. Currently, the governor and other senior officials have been ignored. Their supplies are still not worn out. I'm still dealing with machine guns. By the way, this is a separate video. The tanks on which the guns are installed and supplied to the Ministry of Defense turn out to be unfit for firing. This is what Rodriguez and other volunteers are also trying to do. He writes, in less than 3 years, the main self-defense and tank management department of the Russian Federation has also failed to establish dynamic defense supplies for fighting tank forces, Rodriguez concludes. It's very good that refs complain constantly that they get caught in the act of theft of money that they don't trust. Hopefully, it will be even more scaled up because, of course, half of the Russian army is usually dependent on refs and volunteers. And the more grateful we are to you that you continue to help fund fundraising for the Ukrainian army. Everything's clear, and you are indeed greatly supporting the Ukrainian troops, which gives you a huge bow first. In another post found by Filipov, who's gathered immeasurably in recent days, writes the Russian soldier in subscription to the little-known Z channel Wally's Volker. Today, he read news about our army and the appearance of UAVs into inevitable parts of modern warfare, then went to raise some 10,000 rubles from the platoon to Mavic to find the wounded, the one that costs exactly 170,000. And that's all we have. I often hear from the personnel, Commander, when will the war end? I don't know what to say, truth or something encouraging. If it's true, then to end the war of our victory, we finally need to refuel our supplies. We need communication to be via standard radios, not lure, Motorolls, Karasins purchased for their own use. Air Force A must be military, not purchased for nothing. We need to provide a fighter, a front, so long as our figures don't argue about it, that they can see from the cabinet what's needed in the trench. Recently, we were sent a drone vehicle for evacuation and we feel happy about it, but again, its 5 km/HTTH is amazingly unwavering. It loses a signal after 2 kilometers and they made a border around the vehicle. Name. Hi, Bedro, so the number 300 couldn't encircle it himself. But that's on the line, so the most interesting part starts here. For me, as a military commander, battalion is demanding a photo report on its combat operations, and I'm thinking about how to do it. That thing is on the line, it should be taken down somehow in case of damage, but to write it down, it would be necessary to pull it out and hand it over even if it's destroyed. That's why we're fighting. Everything is for the sake of the report. No one gives a damn about people. The war won't end until we change our attitude to them at a systematic level, he writes. The maximum term for unauthorized absence of a unit for the convicts recruited for the war will increase from 5 to 12 years. The Government Commission on Law Enforcement has approved the law to strengthen the responsibility for former convicts who signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense, he writes. The changes will be submitted through 3 articles in the Criminal Codex: a self-reliant leave of the unit in Sochi, desertion and deviations from the duties of military service by simulating ill or other means, Articles 337, 38, and 39 of the Criminal Code, the state agency notes. The changes concerns prisoners released from punishment after signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Now, they face deprivation for a period of 7 to 12 years, according to the self-reliant leave of the unit. At the moment, it is up to 5 years, the TASS writes. As the RBC reports, a link to sources for desertion of prisoners with weapons or a group of individuals is proposed to prevent them from 10 to 12 years. Now, it is up to 10. As for avoiding having to go to military service by simulating his or her condition in 7 to 12 ways, now it is up to 7. Another turn to a stormy legislative activity allows to assume that the problem with desertion among former prisoners remains especially sharp, although it is impossible to verify, because there is no data on the number of self-reliant in the break-in between prisoners and ordinary contractors. However, given that desertion in the Russian army as a whole is growing like firewood, as evidenced by recent assessments by Ukrainian analyst Tadorigami and his team at Frontal Engines Inside, which reported that twice or even 3 times in some directions the number of prisoners had increased, it is assumed that in the near future all other soldiers will also receive good news. True, that won't happen, especially since now instead of prisons, courts increasingly impose conditional punishments, return to units and subsequent nullification of local assaults. I've told you before how Russian governors force local civilians into the so-called national messenger Max, publishing warnings about unmanned and missile threats only there, not on Telegram. Now the Russians, trying to find relatives lost in war with Ukraine, force messenger Max to recognize bodies and resume the results of a DNC analysis, according to Syrskyi. At the end of July, military resupply unit Sarmat deleted bot, letting it know the DNC expert status. Now only genuine information is received in the national messenger. This decision was explained by the law emphasizing responsibility for violating personnel violations. The relatives write in Telegram chats that all information is shared via bot only. The same groups discuss that now a national messenger is also needed to recognize bodies in the Rostov morgue. Now the confirmation uses video. You are asked to download the Max application, as video calls to WhatsApp are currently forbidden in Russia, so everyone chooses Max. Download the application correctly. I use SIM, writes one of the chat's participants. One relative confirmed Syrskyi that video detections now only happen in Max, as calls to other messengers are blocked in Russia. Which, by the way, is not true, but still. She didn't set it up for 2 days, then it was decided. It's not all the data that need to be set up, it's all set up. She called them the detections passed, the woman explained. So Messenger Max catch it even in the morgue, their famous phrase. Basically, I didn't talk to Max about this because I'm not a Max fan, I'm just joking. Because Max, well, there's nothing to talk about him. He's going through a screw-in, he's going over how to transfer everyone to the regiment, right? Because even in stupidity he's insecure, even though he clearly provides some data. In my view, it's a boring psychological story, but if you're interested in my opinion, I saw someone saying, if everyone follows Messenger Max, it means the war with Europe is coming soon, it means mobilization is coming soon, and all that. In my view, it has nothing to do with each other. If you want to listen, let me know in the comments, and we'll make an episode about this Max, a total scumbag. But basically, again, you know there's a joke, but I'll tell you about it in a separate episode because I believe that. People come to me sometimes like, Michael, we're forced to work for Max, what should we do? I say, well, your people F***CKS**TS, so what? And if tomorrow you're told you'll be shoved into your ass, well, for me that's strange. I understand everything except difficult situations, all my restrictions and so on. But listen, it's your choice to be or not to be. Why ask me for this topic? I made my choice a long time ago. So this was Michael Nacke with you, and until next time, all the best, goodbye.